Göbekli Tepe. The year is 9600 BCE. You are standing on a barren limestone ridge in the Taurus Mountains of southeastern Turkey, and you are watching stone move. Not small stone. Pillars of limestone taller than a grown man, each one weighing between 10 and 20 tons, being shaped, lifted, and locked into perfect circular rings by people who, according to every textbook you have ever read, are supposed to be illiterate, nomadic, and completely incapable of organized construction. They have no metal tools, they have no wheel, they do not yet farm, they do not have cities, or writing, or kings, and yet they are building a temple so sophisticated it will take humanity another 6,000 years to attempt anything like it again. In 1963, a Kurdish shepherd noticed strange stones jutting from a hilltop near the modern city of Şanlıurfa. Nobody paid much attention. Then in 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute arrived, took one look, and understood immediately that something was wrong with the timeline. He spent the rest of his life digging here until his death in 2014. What he found rewrote the oldest chapter of human history, whether the history books were ready or not. The numbers alone are staggering. Radiocarbon dating of organic material at the site places the earliest construction layer between 9600 and 8800 BCE, making it at least 11,600 years old. Stonehenge was built around 2500 BCE. That means Göbekli Tepe is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It is older than the wheel, older than the first city, older than the first written word. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2012 revealed approximately 200 T-shaped pillars still buried underground, suggesting the portion excavated so far represents less than 5% of the full complex. The pillars that have been uncovered stand up to 5.5 meters tall. They are carved with foxes, lions, snakes, vultures, scorpions, and cranes. Not the prey animals you would expect from hunters celebrating a good season, but precisely the creatures associated across dozens of ancient cultures with death, danger, and the spirit world. Pillar 43, known among researchers as the vulture stone, carries an arrangement of carved symbols that astronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte and researcher Paul Burley argued in a paper published in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry encodes a star map recording a comet impact around 10,950 BCE. Whether that interpretation holds or not, the sophistication of the carving alone demands an explanation. These are not the scratches of people figuring out how stone works. These are the deliberate compositions of people who already knew. Then there is the detail that changes everything. Around 8000 BCE, the entire complex was buried, not abandoned, not collapsed, deliberately, carefully, ritually sealed under hundreds of tons of fill material, a mixture of animal bones, flint tools, and human fragments packed in with obvious intentionality. Someone gave the order to cover this place and never return. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was, whoever built it decided at some agreed-upon moment that it needed to disappear. The mainstream archaeological explanation is that Göbekli Tepe was a ceremonial gathering site built by mobile hunter-gatherer communities. The accepted view holds that large-scale cooperation predated agriculture and that religion, not farming, was the true engine of early civilization. Klaus Schmidt himself argued this before his death, and it is a serious evidence-based position. The deliberate burial might represent a ritual closing, a symbolic ending of one sacred era before the next began. But if hunter-gatherers built this, where did they live? No domestic structures, no hearths, no storage pits consistent with habitation have been found within 30 kilometers of the site. The coordination required to quarry, carve, transport, and erect 20-ton pillars across 20 separate enclosures over 800 years does not fit the behavioral model of small, seasonally mobile bands. And the burial itself, organized, total, and permanent, implies an institution with memory long enough to decide that something this important needed to be hidden from whatever was coming next. Who gave that order? What were they afraid of? And what did they know that we are only beginning to rediscover? From a buried temple that predates civilization, we turn to the event that may explain why it was buried. A catastrophe written not in myth, but in ice. The Younger Dryas Impact Event. Picture a perfectly ordinary morning on the North American continent, 12,900 years ago. Mammoths move across open grassland. A sophisticated human culture, the Clovis people, is carving fluted spear points from flint, leaving behind a tool tradition so elegant that archaeologists will spend decades arguing about how it was invented. Then, in what may have been a single morning, the sky catches fire. A fragmented comet wide enough to shadow a city detonates across the upper atmosphere. The firestorm chars an area the size of a continent. Temperatures plummet by 10 degrees Celsius within a decade. The mammoths disappear. The Clovis people disappear. A 1,200-year ice age descends without warning. Most history teachers will tell you this never happened. The problem is that it left a calling card in every layer of dirt on Earth. In 2007, geophysicist Richard Firestone of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, co-authored with 25 researchers across 16 institutions, presenting a striking argument. At a geological boundary layer dated consistently to approximately 12,900 years ago, a layer now called the Younger Dryas boundary, they found something that should not exist if the cause of the cooling was simply ocean circulation. They found nanodiamonds. Specifically, they found Lonsdaleite, a hexagonal form of diamond that, as far as science currently understands, only forms under the extreme pressure and heat of a cosmic impact. It does not occur in any known terrestrial geological process. Firestone's team identified it at 10 sites across North America and Europe. In 2009, James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara published confirmation in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The nanodiamonds were real, the layer was real, and it was everywhere. Then came Greenland. In 2018, a team led by Danish geologist Kurt Kjær published findings in Science Advances describing a 31-kilometer-wide impact crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland, buried under 930 meters of ice. The crater's size and location made it a candidate for the Younger Dryas impact, though its precise date remains under scientific debate. That same year, the Greenland ice core record showed a platinum spike at the Younger Dryas boundary, the same chemical fingerprint left by the Chicxulub impact that ended the dinosaurs, just at a vastly smaller scale. At Abu Huraira in Syria, one of the earliest permanent human settlements ever excavated, archaeologist Andrew Moore of Columbia University found the Younger Dryas boundary layer embedded directly within the habitation level. Inside it were melted mud brick, charred grain, spherules of fused platinum-iron alloy, and human skeletal remains that appeared to have died instantly. The settlement was not abandoned, it was scorched. Across North America, 35 genera of large mammals disappear simultaneously at this boundary. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, short-faced bears, American horses, American camels, gone all at once, right at the same geological line. The Clovis culture, The most sophisticated stone tool tradition yet seen in the Americas also vanishes from the record at this precise moment. The conventional explanation is a combination of climate stress and human hunting pressure. But the Clovis people themselves were presumably also hunters, and they vanished at the same time as their prey. Mainstream geology and archaeology accept the Younger Dryas as a real and devastating climatic event. The dominant non-impact explanation involves the sudden draining of glacial Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean circulation and triggering rapid cooling. It is a well-supported model. Climate disruption of this severity could plausibly collapse megafaunal populations and force human migrations that severed cultural continuity. But ocean circulation collapse does not produce nanodiamonds. It does not deposit a global platinum layer. It does not simultaneously scatter shock quartz across 4 separate continents in a single thin geological line. The chemical signature of the Younger Dryas boundary does not match a climate event. It matches a rock from space. Some researchers now ask a harder question. If Abu Huraira was a functioning permanent settlement at the moment of impact, what else was functioning? What were humans building across those millennia before 12,900 BCE that we simply have not found? Because the fire burned it, and then the ice buried the ashes for 1,000 years on top. The Younger Dryas did not just change the climate. Some believe it may have erased a chapter of human history so completely that we have not yet realized the chapter existed. From a catastrophe written in ice and platinum, we cross the width of the Eurasian continent to a bronze box pulled from the bottom of the sea, a device that suggests someone survived the forgetting with their knowledge intact. The Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, a Greek sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis descended into the wreck of a Roman cargo ship resting 45 meters below the surface of the Aegean Sea, off the island of Antikythera. He came back up pale. He told his captain there were bodies on the seafloor. The captain went down to look. What he found wasn't bodies. It was bronze. A corroded mass pulled to the surface and deposited in a museum, where it sat in a box for 50 years because nobody could work out what it was. It took the invention of the X-ray machine to reveal the truth. Inside the crust of corrosion were gears, at least 37 of them, precisely cut, interlocking, fitted inside a wooden box roughly the size of a shoebox. The object was a computer, a fully functional astronomical calculator. It had been sitting at the bottom of the Aegean for 2,000 years, and nothing remotely like it would be built again for 1,400 years. The device is dated to approximately 87 BCE based on the astronomical calendar inscriptions on its surface, with a margin of roughly 15 years either way. The Roman shipwreck carrying it has been dated to approximately 70 to 60 BCE based on the style of the amphorae in the cargo hold. The Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, a multinational team using three-dimensional X-ray tomography and polynomial texture mapping, decoded the inscriptions on its dials between 2005 and 2006. What they found was extraordinary. The front dial displayed the positions of the sun and moon in the zodiac. The back panel contained a spiral calendar tracking 233 lunar months, the Metonic cycle, with individual cells marking the dates of Panhellenic Games, including the Olympics. A separate dial tracked the Saros cycle, the 223-month period after which solar and lunar eclipses repeat. The mechanism predicted eclipses accurate to within 1 day across an 18-year span. In 2021, a team from University College London, led by Tony Freeth, published a comprehensive reconstruction of the front panel mechanism in Scientific Reports. They determined that the device used an epicyclic pin and slot gear system, a mechanism that allows one gear to wobble eccentrically inside another, replicating the irregular motion of the Moon as it speeds up and slows down in its elliptical orbit. This is not a concept that fell accidentally into place. It required a theoretical understanding of lunar kinematics that Freeth's team described as demanding extraordinary mathematical sophistication. The team spent 4 years solving the mechanism. A Greek craftsman built it in roughly 87 BCE. The gear teeth are cut to a modular precision of approximately half a millimeter. The month names inscribed on the Metonic dial are in a Doric dialect associated with northwestern Greece or Corinth. An inscription referencing the Epirot League helped historian Alexander Jones of New York University's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World narrow the device's origin to the region around Corinth or Rhodes. In his 2017 book, A Portable Cosmos, Jones made a point that stops you cold. He argued that the Antikythera mechanism was not a unique one-off masterpiece. Based on the quality of its construction and the casual way ancient writers like Cicero mentioned similar devices as conversation pieces in educated Roman homes, Jones concluded it was a commercial product, which means there was an industry. Workshops, apprentices, technical manuals, a supply chain for precision bronze work. And it has vanished so completely that this single corroded box from the bottom of the sea is the only evidence any of it ever existed. The mainstream explanation is compelling. Hellenistic Greece achieved remarkable peaks of mechanical ingenuity, and the tradition was gradually lost as the Roman world de-emphasized theoretical mechanics in favor of military and civil engineering. Knowledge, like civilizations, can be fragile. What isn't written down or institutionalized can disappear within a generation. But if similar devices were common enough for Cicero to mention them casually, the tradition was institutionalized. There were schools, manuals, masters, and apprentices. 1,400 years of silence is not gradual loss, that is erasure. And the question some researchers quietly ask is whether the astronomical knowledge encoded in those gears, knowledge ultimately derived from Babylonian eclipse records stretching back 1,000 years before the device was built, points to a continuous thread of precision science far older and far more geographically connected than the textbooks acknowledge. Who taught the Babylonians to track the Saros cycle? How did they accumulate the millennium of eclipse observations that eventually ended up inside a bronze box at the bottom of the Aegean? From the floor of that sea, we travel east across a continent to a hillside in China, where rooms the size of aircraft hangars were carved in total secrecy and then forgotten so thoroughly that even the people who built them left no trace in the historical record. The Longyu Caves. In June of 1992, a farmer named Wu Anai got tired of a pond near his village in Longyu County, Zhejiang Province, southeastern China, that had never once dried out despite its shallow appearance. He rented a pump, started draining it, and after 17 days of continuous pumping, the water was gone. Underneath was not rock. It was a room. A vast arching room with walls carved in perfect parallel lines, stretching away into the dark further than his torch could reach. He called his neighbors. They drained the next pond. Another room, then another, 24 in total, each one large enough to shelter a passenger jet, each one bearing the exact same chisel mark pattern across every single surface, walls, ceilings, floors, supporting pillars, cut at precisely 60 degrees to the horizontal, uniform across millions of square meters of carved stone. And not one word about any of them appeared in any Chinese text, in any dynasty, in any historical record, anywhere. A team from Southeast University in Nanjing arrived to investigate. What they measured staggered them. The 24 caves together represent an excavated rock volume exceeding 1 million cubic meters. That is enough displaced stone in raw volume to account for the construction material of multiple Great Pyramids, and not a gram of it has been found anywhere in the surrounding landscape. No rubble piles, no collapsed fill, no ancient spoil heaps. Over 1 million cubic meters of siltstone was carved out of the earth by hand and removed to an unknown location, leaving behind chambers with vaulted ceilings up to 30 meters high, and the entire enterprise left zero physical evidence of how it was done or where the waste went. The individual caves are connected to adjacent chambers by doorways cut at precisely the same height. The pillars left standing inside each cave are positioned to distribute the ceiling load efficiently, demonstrating not improvised digging, but engineered structural planning for compressive load distribution across irregular siltstone. The walls, ceilings, and even floors carry the 60-degree parallel chisel marks so uniformly that researchers from visiting Japanese institutions describe the pattern as appearing mechanically produced. Whatever tool made these marks was applied with a consistency that current archaeological understanding struggles to attribute to purely handheld instruments working in dim lamplight 2,000 years ago. Carbon dating of organic material recovered from the caves places human activity at the site to approximately the Qin or pre-Qin period, before 221 BCE, though no single accepted peer-reviewed study has established a definitive construction date. This makes the Longyu Caves one of the only major archaeological sites in China, a country with meticulous historical records going back thousands of years, that exists entirely outside the documentary record. The Qin dynasty burned competing historical texts during unification, and Chinese archaeologists have suggested that records of the caves may have been among the casualties of that purge. The decorative motifs on the walls, fish, horses, geometric patterns, are consistent broadly with ancient Chinese art, but match no specific dynasty's aesthetic canon precisely enough to allow dating by style alone. And then there is the matter of the entrances. The caves were sealed with water. The ponds covering them had apparently been maintained, whether deliberately or accidentally, for centuries or millennia before Wu Anai drained the first one. Local villagers had used those ponds for fishing for generations, with no tradition or memory of anything beneath them. The mainstream explanation holds that the caves were likely constructed by the ancient Yue kingdom, possibly as storage facilities, defensive refuges, or quarry pits whose decorative finishing served a ceremonial function. The absence of records is attributed to the destruction of Yue kingdom documents during Qin unification. It is a plausible administrative explanation for a documentary gap. But storage facilities do not require every surface finished to a uniform 60-degree tolerance across 1 million cubic meters. That specification implies a governing purpose far more significant than grain storage, and a workforce operating under instructions so precise that 24 separate teams working in 24 separate caverns reproduce the same decorative and structural choices without a single surviving written order. Some researchers ask whether the Longyu Caves were not built by the Yue kingdom at all, but inherited from something much older. Whether the flooding of the entrances was not wartime concealment, but the same ritual sealing of sacred spaces we saw Göbekli Tepe undergo 6,000 years earlier and a continent away. The stone remembers, the records do not, and now we climb, from anonymous rooms sealed beneath Chinese fields to the top of the world, where someone cut stone to tolerances that should have been physically impossible. Pumapunku. You are standing on the Bolivian Altiplano at 3,840 meters above sea level. The air is thin enough to make your head swim. Around you are scattered what look, at first, like the ruins of a building site. Massive stone blocks tipped and tumbled as if thrown by a giant. But as your eyes adjust, you begin to see what these blocks actually are. They are H-shaped. Precisely, identically, interchangeably H-shaped. The surfaces are flat enough to function as optical mirrors. The right angles are true. The drill holes are perfect circles with interior walls that show no spiral deviation. Where two blocks meet, the joint is so tight that no blade, no paper, nothing thinner than a human hair can be inserted between them. And then someone tells you that the largest of these blocks weighs 131 metric tons. That the nearest quarry for the red sandstone they are cut from is 90 kilometers away across the surface of Lake Titicaca. And that the civilization that built this, by the accepted chronology, had no iron tools, no wheel, and no written language. Pumapunku is part of the broader Tiwanaku complex in western Bolivia, and the conventional archaeological dating places the Tiwanaku culture's peak between roughly 500 and 900 CE. Osvaldo Rivera, the Bolivian archaeologist who conducted extensive excavations at the site, and Alan Collada of the University of Chicago, who studied Tiwanaku for decades, both documented the engineering achievements here with a thoroughness that makes the mystery harder to dismiss, not easier. The heaviest red sandstone block on site has been estimated at 131 metric tons. The andesite blocks, a harder, denser stone quarried from the Copacabana Peninsula across Lake Titicaca, approximately 10 kilometers by water, weigh up to 85 metric tons each. Geochemical trace element analysis confirmed the andesite's origin, which means someone transported 85 metric ton blocks either by reed raft across an Andean lake or overland along a route that has left no evidence of road infrastructure. The H-shaped blocks are what really demand explanation. There are multiple examples at the site, and they are interchangeable. Any H block can be fitted into any corresponding H slot. This is modular construction. It requires blueprints, specifications, quality control, and a measurement system accurate enough to be reproduced consistently across a construction team working in high-altitude conditions. Researcher Alexei Vranich of the University of Pennsylvania noted that the drill holes found in multiple stone blocks are cut to consistent depths across separate pieces, suggesting the use of some form of template or jig, a standardized drilling apparatus rather than freehand work. The surface flatness of the primary facing stones has been measured and found to deviate by less than 1 millimeter across surfaces up to a meter wide. That tolerance is within the range of modern machined stone. The mainstream archaeological explanation is organized state labor. At its height, the Tiwanaku state commanded a substantial regional empire and could deploy thousands of workers under the Ameta system of labor taxation. The model involves stone pounding with harder stones, abrasive finishing, reed raft transport across the lake, and the sort of slow, patient accumulation of precision that unlimited human time and motivation can eventually achieve. It is a serious explanation, and the Tiwanaku were unquestionably sophisticated builders. But stone pounding does not produce consistent circular drill holes with rigid interior profiles. Abrasive hand finishing does not achieve sub-millimeter surface flatness across standardized modular units. And the existence of interchangeable H blocks implies a quality control system, a means of verifying that each block meets the specification before it is transported 90 kilometers and slotted into place, for which no evidence, no measuring instruments, no administrative records has ever been recovered at the site. The Tiwanaku left extraordinary art, sophisticated agriculture, and a complex iconographic tradition. They did not leave us the manual for Pumapunku. The Viracocha myth, carved into the nearby Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku itself, describes a creator god who arrived following a great flood, taught civilization to surviving humanity, and then departed westward across the Pacific. The iconographic figure holding two staffs surrounded by winged attendants appears in structurally identical form in the earlier Chavin and Wari cultures of Peru, and, as we noted in our first item, in a nearly identical composition on a pillar at Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years earlier and 13,000 kilometers away. Some researchers ask whether Pumapunku is not just a building, whether it is a message, and whether we are still too early in our understanding to read it. From stone cut to impossible precision at the top of the world, we descend, in altitude and in time, to 3 small clay tablets in a Romanian museum that carry a message nobody wants to hear. The Tertăria tablets. The history of writing, as it is taught in every classroom on Earth, begins in Sumer, ancient Iraq, around 3400 BCE. The Sumerians invented the written word, that is the sentence, full stop, end of chapter, next slide. Then, in 1961, a Romanian archaeologist named Nicolae Vlasa was sifting through a Neolithic burial pit near the village of Tartaria, in what is now the Transylvania region of Romania, when he found 3 small clay tablets covered in symbols. They looked in many ways like early Sumerian pictographic script. He sent samples for radiocarbon dating. The results came back at approximately 5300 BCE, nearly 2,000 years before the first Sumerian writing. Vlasa spent years defending the authenticity of the find. The mainstream response was to relabel the symbols as a pre-writing notation system and quietly decline to update the chapter. Vlasa died in 1978. The tablets are still in a museum in Cluj-Napoca. The textbooks still begin writing in Sumer. The 3 tablets Vlasa found were not isolated curiosities. They were excavated from a deliberate ritual burial, a pit containing the cremated remains of an elderly adult alongside alabaster figurines, a spondylus shell bracelet imported from the Aegean coast, and the tablets themselves. The cremation is itself anomalous. The Vinca culture, which occupied southeastern Europe from approximately 5500 to 3500 BCE, typically practiced inhumation. Whoever this person was, they were treated differently in death. The tablets appear to have been sacred objects associated with a specific, significant individual. The symbols on the tablets number approximately 50 across the 3 pieces. One round perforated tablet features a divided central panel with pictographic signs, including a horned animal, a tree-like form, and an abstract human figure. The other 2 carry linear and geometric marks. What makes scholars uncomfortable is not the symbols taken individually. It is their structural relationship to early Sumerian proto-cuneiform. Asko Parpola of the University of Helsinki, one of the world's foremost authorities on early writing systems, published analysis noting that several Tartaria signs are structurally similar to specific Sumerian symbols, including signs for deity, foreign land, and numerical notation. Harold Harmon of the Institute for Archaeomythology conducted a detailed sign-by-sign comparison and identified 21 Tartaria symbols with direct parallels in early Mesopotamian sign lists. The critical point in Harmon's analysis is that some of these matches are not pictographic. They are not both cultures independently drawing an ox to mean ox. They are abstract, non-pictographic signs carrying apparently identical semantic functions with no obvious visual referent in nature. That kind of match is harder to dismiss as convergence. Multiple AMS radiocarbon dating studies of bone material from the same burial context have consistently returned dates in the range of 5300 to 5000 BCE. This places the tablets firmly within the Vinca culture's documented period. Maria Gimbutas of UCLA, in her landmark work, The language of the goddess identified the broader Vinca symbol system, found across more than 1,000 sites in southeastern Europe, as a coherent, geographically distributed notation system that predates and potentially precedes Sumerian script by centuries. The mainstream position is that the Vinca symbols constitute a sophisticated pre-writing notation system, a means of recording ownership, ritual tallies, or craft identity, that never crossed the threshold into true writing, defined as the capacity to represent spoken language. The resemblance to Sumerian proto-cuneiform is attributed to the universal human tendency to derive graphic symbols from common visual experiences. It is a defensible position. But the argument that two separate cultures independently generated the same abstract, non-pictographic signs with the same apparent semantic functions across a 2,000-year gap with the earlier version in Romania strains the boundaries of coincidence past the point of comfort. And the dating evidence, if it holds, means that if there is a genuine connection between Balkan Neolithic notation and Sumerian script, the knowledge traveled south and east toward Mesopotamia, not the other way around, which would mean the birthplace of writing is not in Iraq. It is in Romania, on 3 small tablets that the academic world has spent 60 years finding reasons not to discuss. Some researchers ask whether this was truly a dead-end notation system, or whether it was the upstream source of a river of symbolic thought that eventually reached Sumer, was formalized there, and then became the writing tradition we were taught to call the first. And if they are right, the entire founding myth of recorded history needs a new first page. From a burial pit in Romania, we descend beneath an ocean, because one of the most consequential discoveries in the archaeology of civilization isn't on land at all. The submerged city of Dwarka. The Mahabharata, one of the oldest epic texts on Earth, describes a city called Dwarka in specific, almost architectural detail. It was a city of 900,000 royal palaces, built by the divine craftsman Vishwakarma for the god Krishna, set at the mouth of a river on the western coast of India. The Mahabharata also describes, in Book 16, what happened to it. The sea rose. House by house, street by street, Dwarka was swallowed. The Bhagavata Purana says the ocean took it immediately after Krishna's departure, not gradually, not metaphorically, but in a single event of rapid inundation. For 3,000 years, archaeologists classified this as mythology. Then, in 2001, a team of Indian marine scientists conducting a routine pollution survey in the Gulf of Khambhat off the coast of Gujarat turned on their sonar, and the seafloor showed them a city. The discovery was made by the National Institute of Oceanography in Goa, operating under marine archaeologist S.R. Rao, who had previously conducted underwater surveys near the modern port town of Dwarka in the 1980s and confirmed the existence of a Bronze Age port settlement approximately 3,500 years old. Already remarkable in itself. The 2001 survey was different in scale. The acoustic imaging revealed geometric structures at depths of 30 to 40 meters across a stretch of approximately 9 kilometers. Linear features consistent with walls, a grid-like street network, and structural foundations. Dredging equipment recovered physical samples, processed timber, fragments of pottery with geometric decoration, and other organic material. The wood was sent to Oxford University's Physical and Theoretical Chemistry Laboratory for AMS radiocarbon dating. The result was approximately 7,190 BCE, plus or minus 390 years. That makes the occupation layer of the submerged site roughly 9,500 years old, approximately 5,000 years older than the earliest known Harappan civilization and predating the first Indian urban settlements by several millennia. The sea level data is not controversial. Geological studies by the Indian Meteorological Department and the Geological Survey of India confirm that the current sea floor at 30 to 40 meters depth in the Gulf of Khambat was unambiguously dry land approximately 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. The global sea rise that followed the end of the last ice age, the same post-glacial inundation that followed the Younger Dryas, is well documented. Coastal land was swallowed worldwide. The question is not whether humans lived in what is now the Gulf of Khambat. They demonstrably did. The question is what they built there. The mainstream archaeological response has been significant skepticism. Critics, most prominently archaeologist Shireen Ratnagar, argued that the sonar images were ambiguous, that the dredging method was too imprecise to establish proper stratigraphic context, and that the recovered organic materials, including the timber, could be naturally transported drift material rather than structural elements of a built environment. No formal peer-reviewed excavation of the site has been conducted since 2001. The site has never been formally dived, mapped, and excavated by an independent archaeological team. But Oxford University does not date driftwood and report city walls. The laboratory dated processed timber, wood that shows evidence of working, of human modification. And the acoustic images show right angles. River systems and geological formations produce curves. Right angles are a human signature. Some researchers ask a question that the absence of a formal excavation makes impossible to answer. Is the Gulf of Khambat site what Indian civilization looks like before the sea took it? The Indus Valley Civilization, which appears in the archaeological record around 3300 BCE already fully formed, with standardized weights, advanced urban planning, and a writing system that remains undeciphered, has never yielded a convincing developmental precursor. Could that precursor be sitting in 40 meters of water, undived, undocumented, slowly dissolving into the sediment while institutions argue about whether it merits investigation? And how many other coastal civilizations from the same period are currently sitting at the 30 to 40 meter mark around the world's coastlines, waiting for someone to point a sonar at the seafloor and look? From a city beneath the Indian Ocean, we turn to a discovery that is even more intimate, one buried not beneath water, but inside the human body itself. The Denisovan genome. In 2008, archaeologists working in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia found a piece of bone the size of a child's fingertip, a pinky finger fragment specifically from a juvenile individual. They sent it to Svante Pääbo's ancient DNA laboratory at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, expecting either a Neanderthal result or modern human contamination. What came back in 2010 was neither. The DNA was from a human being, but from a lineage that had separated from Neanderthals approximately 400,000 years ago and had been living alongside our ancestors, unknown to science, for the entirety of recorded history. An entire species, or at minimum a distinct population of humanity, discovered from a fragment of bone smaller than a stick of chewing gum. Yet Pääbo would receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, partly for this work. We named the species Denisovans after the cave, and then we discovered something extraordinary. Their DNA is currently living inside billions of people. The initial 2010 Nature paper, authored by Reich, Green, Kircher, Pääbo, and colleagues, established that the Denisovans were genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens, and that they had interbred with anatomically modern humans at some point during the period when our species was expanding across Asia. The genetic legacy of that interbreeding is not evenly distributed. Approximately 3 to 5% of the genome of present-day Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, and certain Filipino Negrito populations derives from Denisovan ancestry. Populations in mainland Asia and Europe carry significantly less or none. The Denisovans, apparently, had their most sustained contact with the ancestors of people who ended up at the far end of the world, in the islands and coastlines of the Pacific. In 2019, a team led by Fahu Chen published findings in Nature identifying a jawbone from Chiayi County on the Tibetan Plateau as Denisovan. Ancient DNA could not be recovered from the bone at that altitude, but protein analysis confirmed the identification. The bone was dated to at least 160,000 BCE. This means the Denisovans were living at 4,000 meters of altitude in Tibet at least 160 millennia ago, roughly 120,000 years before modern humans arrived on that plateau. And here is the part that reframes everything. Modern Tibetan populations carry a specific variant of the EPAS1 gene that regulates hemoglobin production at high altitude and allows humans to function normally where most people would develop dangerous blood thickening. This variant was not evolved independently by Tibetans. A study by Emilia Huerta Sanchez and colleagues published in Nature in 2014 demonstrated that Tibetans inherited this adaptation from Denisovans. The genetic tool that allows people to live on the roof of the world was borrowed from a species that got there first. The entire physical Denisovan fossil record, as of the mid-2020s, consists of 4 teeth, 1 phalanx, a partial skull fragment, the Chiayi mandible, and 1 extraordinary bone fragment nicknamed Denny, whose 2018 analysis by Vivian Slan and colleagues in Nature revealed her to be the first-generation offspring of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. Direct proof of interspecies reproduction, a hybrid child in a cave in Siberia 50,000 years ago. The mainstream paleoanthropological explanation is that Denisovans were an archaic human population, sister group to the Neanderthals, distributed across Asia from Siberia to Southeast Asia and absorbed into the modern human gene pool through intermittent contact at geographic range boundaries. The asymmetric genetic signal, strongest in Melanesia rather than near Siberia, is attributed to complex migration patterns of early modern humans as they moved through Southeast Asia on their way to Australia and the Pacific. But some researchers point out that the geographic distribution of Denisovan DNA makes more sense if the Denisovans were not a thin scatter of cave-dwelling mountain people, but a substantial maritime or coastal population occupying the territory that is now the South China Sea, a vast continental shelf that was dry land during the last glacial maximum and was gradually swallowed by post-glacial sea rise between 15,000 and 7,000 BCE. A coastal Denisovan civilization would have been erased by rising water, leaving nothing behind but the genes of people who interbred with them before the sea took their homeland. Just as the textbooks have no chapter for Dwarka, they may have no chapter for the Denisovans, not because nothing was there, but because the ocean wrote that chapter in salt and sediment rather than stone. From a species found in a fingertip, we turn to a mystery written in bone. In skulls that carry an anatomy the textbooks have no clean explanation for. The Paracas elongated skulls. There is a skull in the Paracas History Museum on the coast of southern Peru that will stop you cold the first time you see it. It is human-sized. It is human-shaped, mostly. But the cranium, the dome of bone above the face, extends backward and upward into a long, smooth cone, adding a full third to the vertical height of the skull. You tell yourself it is artificial cranial deformation. You have heard of this. Cultures across the ancient world bound their infants' heads between boards to reshape the growing bone, a status marker, a sign of nobility. Then the curator tells you that this skull has one parietal plate, not two, and that its measured cranial volume is 25% larger than any artificially deformed human skull recorded in the scientific literature, and that there are over 300 more in the storeroom. The Paracas necropolis was discovered by Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Tello in 1928 on the Paracas Peninsula in the Ica region of southern coastal Peru. The site contained over 400 mummified individuals, many bundled in textiles of extraordinary quality. Some of the finest pre-Columbian fabrics ever recovered, woven with iconographic complexity that would require a master artisan weeks to produce. The individuals with the most dramatically elongated skulls were consistently wrapped in the finest textiles, placed in the most elaborate burial bundles, and given the highest status grave goods. The elongation was not distributed randomly across the population. It was concentrated in the elite. Carbon dating of the mummies places the occupation of the necropolis from approximately 900 BCE to 400 CE, a span of over 1,000 years. The distinction between artificial cranial deformation and what is observed in the most extreme Paracas specimens comes down to anatomy. The human skull in infancy is composed of multiple bony plates separated by fibrous joints called sutures. The two large plates at the top of the skull, the parietal bones, are separated by the sagittal suture, which runs front to back along the midline of the crown. Artificial cranial deformation works by applying pressure to the front and back of the skull during infancy, causing the parietal bones to expand upward and sideways. The sutures remain. The number of plates remains. The total volume of bone tissue remains within the normal human range, averaging 1,200 to 1,600 cubic centimeters, because deformation redistributes existing bone without generating new tissue. Multiple Paracas skulls exhibit a single, unified parietal plate with no sagittal suture. Physical anthropologist John Verano of Tulane University, who conducted detailed osteological analysis of Paracas skeletal material, documented that the elongation in these specimens occurs along the posterior superior axis, a directional axis that no documented binding technique can produce because binding acts on the anterior-posterior axis only. And the cranial volume figures recorded for the most extreme specimens, ranging up to 2,200 and even 2,500 cubic centimeters in some assessments, exceed the maximum recorded for any artificially deformed skull in the comparative literature. The mainstream position is that all Paracas skulls represent artificial cranial deformation, with the extreme examples attributed to unusually aggressive or prolonged binding, measurement variability in deformed crania, and a possible frequency of craniosynostosis, the premature fusion of cranial sutures that may have been selectively preserved in elite burials because of its visual association with the desired elongated form. But craniosynostosis is not a cosmetic variant. It is a pathological condition that causes dangerous intracranial pressure, developmental complications, and, without surgical intervention, typically fatal outcomes in infancy. It is not heritable as a normal dominant trait. The idea that a population could maintain craniosynostosis as a stable, visually consistent feature of its ruling class across more than 1,000 years of continuous burials without any of the developmental pathology that should accompany it contradicts the clinical literature on the condition. Some researchers ask whether the Paracas skeletal anomalies, the single parietal plate, the directional axis of elongation, the excess cranial volume, represent something other than pathology or artificial deformation. Whether the cultures that subsequently adopted artificial elongation across 6 continents were not inventing a fashion independently, but attempting to physically replicate the appearance of a group whose elongated head, shape they associated with authority, wisdom, or divine origin. The same question arises when you look at the elongated clay figurines of the Ubaid culture of ancient Mesopotamia, the skull morphology depicted in royal portraits of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten's family, and the skull-binding practices of the Huns, the Maya, and the Mangbetu of the Congo. All of them reaching for the same shape, across oceans and millennia, as if everyone was trying to look like someone specific. Who was that someone? And, from the mystery of ancient anatomy, we arrive at our final item, one that suggests the people of the ancient world understood not just biology, but physics, in ways that the official history of science has preferred not to examine. The Baghdad Battery. It is sometime in the 1930s. A German archaeologist named Wilhelm König is cataloging artifacts in the basement storage of the National Museum of Iraq when he picks up a clay jar about the size of a large coffee thermos. It is unremarkable at first glance. A simple ceramic vessel, sealed at the top with asphalt. But inside, displaced and visible through the open top, is a copper cylinder. And inside the copper cylinder is an iron rod, separated from the copper by the asphalt seal. König sets it down, picks up his pen, and writes one sentence in his notebook that will be argued about for nearly a century. This object, he writes, could have served as an electrical element. He is describing a galvanic cell. The fundamental mechanism of the battery. Built roughly 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta demonstrated the first modern electrochemical cell in 1800 CE. The jar was excavated near the village of Kuyut Rabua, approximately 30 kilometers southeast of Baghdad, from a site attributed to the Parthian period, roughly 250 BCE to 224 CE. König published his hypothesis in 1940 in a German scientific journal, framing it carefully as a possibility rather than a certainty. The response from the archaeological establishment was broadly dismissal. The jar was catalogued as a storage vessel, possibly for sacred scrolls or organic liquids, and the internal arrangement of copper cylinder and iron rod was attributed to coincidence or natural corrosion processes. The physics, however, did not care about the dismissal. The configuration of the Baghdad Battery, a copper cylinder containing an iron rod, separated by an asphalt insulating stopper inside a clay jar, is, in the language of modern electrochemistry, a galvanic cell. Two dissimilar metals in contact with an electrolytic solution generate a voltage differential through spontaneous oxidation-reduction reactions. This is not a theory. It is one of the most reproducible phenomena in all of chemistry. American physicist Willard Gray constructed a working replica using grape juice as the electrolyte and confirmed electrical output of approximately 1.5 volts of direct current, sufficient to electroplate a thin layer of silver or gold onto a metal surface. German archaeologist Arne Eggebrecht subsequently used a replica to electroplate a silver statuette in 1978, reportedly achieving a coating layer of approximately 3/10,000ths of an inch, consistent with the kind of surface treatment that would be nearly indistinguishable from solid precious metal under visual inspection. But there are at least 10 additional clay jars of identical dimensions found at the same excavation site, same size, same asphalt-sealed openings, but without the copper cylinder and iron rod components. The internal metallic elements were either never installed in these vessels, removed in antiquity for reuse, or decomposed. The presence of 10 standardized outer casings matching the Baghdad Battery's dimensions suggests this was not a unique object, it was a type. And if it was a type, it was made in quantity, for a purpose, by people who knew what it was for. The mainstream explanation holds that the Baghdad battery was a storage vessel, most likely for acidic liquids or sacred documents, and that the copper and iron components were coincidentally present or the result of corrosion from stored contents. Since no Parthian-era workshop equipment associated with electroplating has been found, and no written record from the period describes an electrical process, mainstream science considers the battery function unproven. Paul Craddock of the British Museum has noted that while the physics of the device are plausible, the archaeological case for ancient electroplating rests on replication experiments rather than direct evidence from the period. But the specific geometry of the Baghdad battery is not coincidental. Copper corroding inside a clay jar does not spontaneously assemble itself into a geometrically centered inner cylinder with an insulated iron rod aligned along its axis. These components were placed deliberately in a specific configuration, and the presence of 10 additional standardized outer vessels at the same site without inner components implies that the inner components were the valuable, reusable elements, removed when the vessel was spent and replaced or recycled. That is the behavior of a workshop, not a storage room. Some researchers ask why we are comfortable with the idea that the Mesopotamians, a civilization that independently developed advanced mathematics, precise astronomy, sophisticated medicine, and the first known written legal code, could not have empirically discovered, through experimentation with metals and acidic solutions, that dissimilar metals in an electrolyte produce a physical effect. We do not require them to have called it electricity. We only require them to have noticed what it did. The National Museum of Iraq was looted during the 2003 invasion. An unknown quantity of documentation and related artifacts from Koenig's original excavation was lost in that event. Whatever contextual records might have clarified the function of these jars or identified similar objects from the same period may no longer exist. History, it seems, has a way of losing the evidence at the most inconvenient possible moment. Look at what we've covered. A temple buried before civilization was supposed to exist, sealed under tons of fill by the people who built it. A cosmic impact that left its chemical fingerprint across 4 continents and may have erased a chapter of human history we haven't fully accounted for. A handheld astronomical computer that opened a 1,400-year gap in the history of technology. 24 aircraft hangar-sized caverns carved from solid rock with no historical record of their construction anywhere in Chinese literature. Stone cut to sub-millimeter tolerances at 4,000 meters of altitude by a culture the textbooks say lacked the tools to do it. Clay tablets in Romania bearing symbols that predate Sumerian writing by 2,000 years. A city 9,500 years old sitting at 40 meters depth in the Gulf of Combat, undived and unexamined. An entire human species discovered from a fingertip whose genetic legacy lives in billions of people alive today. Skulls with the wrong number of bones and excess cranial volume that artificial deformation cannot produce, and a clay jar from ancient Iraq whose internal configuration generates electricity. Taken individually, each of these has a mainstream explanation. Convergent engineering solutions, coincidental symbol similarity, exceptional craftsmanship, ambiguous acoustic data, pathological anatomical variation, coincidental object configuration. These are not dishonest explanations. The people who offer them are, in most cases, serious researchers working from genuine evidence. The skeptical position on each of these items is worth understanding and deserves to be respected. But you are not looking at them individually anymore. You are seeing the full list. And when you see the full list, a different question emerges, not whether any single item is fake or misidentified, but whether our working model of human history, the model of slow linear progress from cave to city to spaceship, each generation marginally smarter and more capable than the last, is actually sufficient to account for all of this at once. Whether the anomalies are isolated or whether they are glimpses of a pattern. A civilization, or perhaps several civilizations, that reached heights we haven't credited, that were interrupted by events we haven't fully incorporated, whose knowledge survived not in institutions but in fragments, in clay tablets, in submerged foundations, in the DNA of people living at the edge of the Pacific, in myths about floods and creator gods carrying staffs. History, as it is taught, is a story with a clean beginning and a straight line running forward to the present. What the evidence suggests is something more like a spiral. A world that rose to extraordinary capability was struck down by ice or fire or rising water and began again, carrying pieces of the old knowledge encoded in stone and symbol and bone. We may not be the first people to build something remarkable. We may be the latest in a series of people who believed they were the first, because everything that came before them was buried, drowned, or dismissed as mythology. Most people accept the footnote. They take the museum's label, close the browser, and move on. The fact that you made it here means you don't. You see the gap between what the evidence actually says and what the official story is willing to admit. That gap is where the real history lives. This channel exists to excavate it. Hit subscribe and make that official. And now I want to hear from you in the comments. Out of these 10 discoveries, which one is the smoking gun? The single piece of evidence you believe the mainstream simply cannot explain away. Pick one and make your case. The floor is yours. The story of humanity is not a straight line drawn from a flint tool to a smartphone. It is a series of lights, brilliant, fragile, often extinguished before the full record could be passed forward. Göbekli Tepe was buried deliberately, sealed under tons of fill, as if someone needed to protect an idea from whatever was coming. 11,600 years later, we are still digging it up, still arguing about what it means, still standing at the edge of a darkness that the textbooks insist isn't there. The question it leaves us with is not really about the past. It is about right now. What are we building? What are we failing to record? And who, 10,000 years from now, will pull it from the earth and ask why no one talked about it? Subscribe. The excavation continues.